Thanks very much. I'm actually very pleased to be here. My wife and I are visiting the United States for a total of 10 months. I'm a Fulbright scholar. I'm sorry, not at Northwestern, sadly, but I'm at Ohio State University in Columbus. And we're actually going to be doing several trips around visiting places. So this is one of them, the trip into Chicago. And this is what I'm going to talk to you today about is something that I would normally offer the biomedical engineers when they come to Cape Town, January, February, I'm not absolutely sure where in time, but it's also a lecture that I give to first-year medical students at University of Cape Town in one form or other. The talk today is going to run through, let me kill the light on the front here, is really going to be in 3 parts. There's quite a bit of material, so I'm going to have to go through fairly quickly, but I'll slow down if you desperately need me to. The first part is kind of an introduction to issues about South Africa and its history. The second part is something to do with understanding the concept of race from a biologist perspective, not a sociologist perspective. You'll see why that's important coming up. And then towards the end, I want to talk a little about research and research categories. I know about the biomedical engineers. I don't know much about the journalists, but I'm prepared to predict that those of you who are going to South Africa as journalists are going to be asked to do research projects. And those research projects, in one way or other, are going to have to involve groups of people. So this issue of groups of people, identifying groups, how that impacts on research, that's going to be the last part of the talk. So it's very directed. I got a motive in the talk. This isn't just me showing off. Well, that's not true. It is me showing off. But it actually has a motive to go with it. Now, let's see. Get all of this. All right. Why is it important to understand the biology of race? It's pretty obvious that it's important to understand the sociology of race, but why the biology? Well, race has a physical characteristic, pervades the way we think of ourselves and other people. It's our method of categorization. So we categorize people by the way they appear, which is, of course, a physical characteristic. Liz and I have sat through the American election. Very entertaining, although I never want to watch another political ad for the rest of my life. But it was interesting to watch, and there were comments about voting blocks, very clearly defined. African-American voting blocks, Hispanic voting blocks, white females got their own voting block. So very much is present in the United States, which we already know of, but in South Africa it has the added situation that for 40 years of South African history, every aspect of life was determined by physical appearance and racial definition, racial categorization. So for South Africans, it's very real and something very important to understand. As a biological concept, it's kind of self-evident. People differ in visual ways. There's good biological reasons for that. We could spend hours talking about the nature of natural selection and how skin color and hair form and cranial shape and whatever else gets selected. But our real problem when we look at people is to realize that not only are there biological differences between people, but there are also cultural differences, and that's going to become a big issue coming up. So how do we know when we're looking at biology? How do we know when we're looking at culture? The current debate about race, you often hear 2 different kind of approaches. The one, which I've heard a lot from the sociologists, is there's no such thing as race. It's an imaginary thing. Well, I'm a biologist. Okay? And race is not imaginary. I see it in every aspect of human variation around the planet. So that becomes an important issue. Also, the second thing I've quoted up there, it's known as the any fool can see theorem. The any fool can see theorem says that people look different if they come from different places on the planet. Okay? So we got a problem here. We got a problem of one group of people saying, well, it's visibly obvious, it must be real. We got another group of people saying, no, it's political, it's social, we can get rid of it if we just wish it away if need be. Well, let's have a look at the South African context. Let's have a look at origins of people, look at the context in South Africa, and see how these debates play out within the South African context. All right. You are now going to get a sweep of history. This is standard 4, 5, 6, which encompasses most of your beginning of high school. So we're going to get 3 years of history lessons telescoped in the next 6 minutes. Okay? brace yourself, here it comes, okay? Sweep. All right. The first group of people we need to be aware of are the Khoikhoi, the Khoikhoi herders and sand hunters. The old names of these people, which still get used occasionally, are Hottentot and Bushmen, which are historic names. The problem is both Hottentot and Bushman as a linguistic term today are insults. To call someone a Hottentot actually has a loaded insult level. To call someone a Bushman, except unless you live in Botswana. It's okay to call somebody a Bushman in Botswana, but it's not okay to call someone a Bushman in Namibia or South Africa. This shows you how precise this can be. But certainly in South Africa, the term Bushman and Hottentots as a term are considered insulting. We're really talking about Khoisan people, and the two groups are the Khoikhoi, those are the herders, and there's a nice picture on this side. It's actually a wonderful picture. It was painted drawn about 1702, and the artist, we still don't even know who the artist was, but we're almost certain he was a student of Rembrandt. And he was traveling to the East Indies, and when he passed through Cape Town about 1702, 1703, 1704, he drew all of these wonderful pictures, and then the ship continued on to what is modern-day Indonesia, and there's a whole bunch of pictures about Indonesia in the same book, and the book was discovered in the 1960s in the basement of the library in Cape Town. Okay? So this was somebody in 1702 observing these people, and a whole bunch of extra things, the way they dress, the way they're decorated, but most importantly, the relationship with cattle and sheep. And in fact, for the Khoikhoi, for the Hottentots, this is the major issue. They're linked in, they're pastoralists historically. And for the San, these are the Bushmen on the left, and this is a photograph taken in the central Kalahari about 25 years ago. And I chuckle at this. I like to say these are four gentlemen thinking about the future of ostrich eggs, which of course is a very short future, presumably. But there it is. And in fact, what we're looking at here is two peoples historically, their living descendants in southern Africa today. Their genetics indicates that these people have lived in the southern African area for at least 100,000 years. They are not primitive people. They are not in any form biologically primitive, but what they have is genetics which says they are the earliest diverged humans. So they're the earliest group of modern humans to appear as modern humans. Okay? Everybody else is more recent, but please don't translate that as primitive. They aren't primitive in any way. Okay? These are modern people. You're going to meet in Cape Town people with this genetic ancestry who are going to speak to you in English quite happily. Okay? In downtown Cape Town. Okay? But their genetics will track back 100,000 years, and that's where this is coming from. The second group of people we need to be aware of in Southern Africa is a group of people who South Africans call black people. South Africans never use the term Bantu. Okay? The term Bantu refers to a Bantu language, and it should be pretty innocuous. It's just about a group of languages, but unfortunately in the 1940s and 1950s, African people in South Africa were administered by the Department of Bantu Affairs. Bantu, therefore, is now a curse word. So the term is never used. But these are black people in Southern Africa. That's a term that's used today. All of them can trace their ancestry in Southern Africa back about 1,500 years, 1,500 years ago. They definitely migrated in from the northeast. And in that diagram up on the far side here, you can see all this dark red area here is the historic location of these people in the 17 and 1800s. Archaeologically, from down in this region down here, we've got archaeological sites at 800 AD, so they've been here a long time. What stopped their movement west was not anybody already living there, but the fact that all of their plants, the sorghum, the plants that they were growing, only grew in conditions with summer rainfall, and this is the winter rainfall or dry area, so that stopped the migration. Okay? Today, we broadly recognize two groups of these people. This group, I'm sorry, you can see that's a slightly deeper shade of red. Do you see that? These are all, they're the Xhosa, Zulu, and Swati, and these people all speak what is called an Nguni language. Okay, all those languages are linked, and the darker red up in this area, these are people whose languages are Sotho-Tswana. So there's at least 2 different divisions within them, and that time depth goes back probably about 800 years. So again, although the apartheid mythology talked about these black people, newcomers moving into the country, well, 1,500 years, I think marks you as no longer a newcomer. Okay, that's being in the neighborhood a long time. So that's the second group. So we got Khoisan groups, and we've got black groups, broadly bound too. And then the next group coming in is all the more recent immigrants, and there's been a whole bunch of them in sets of waves. Okay, from 1652, this was the Dutch East India Colony. And the settlers who came in at that point were primarily Dutch, German, and French. There's kind of a mythology that all that South African Afrikaners are coming from Dutch background. Well, in fact, there are probably as many Germans and French coming in as well. Basically, it's North European plain. And the commonality is religious. So all of these guys coming in were all linked to Protestant churches. Okay, and that's the commonality. That's why there aren't Southerners coming in. Southern Europeans, it's Northern Europe. Southern Europeans are Catholics. That's beyond the pale. Okay, so the guys coming in these early 1600s are Protestants, Dutch, German, and French. They mold into modern times into a group of people called the Cape Dutch, the Afrikaners. But in fact, there's quite a wide range of European origin for these people. But in fact, the roots are all North European plain. Today, the commonality is both religious and language. Okay, so, and the language being Afrikaans, which is a derivative of Dutch. Then from about the 1820s, the next big wave coming in is the English. Okay, and they come in large quantities from the 1820s, okay, and they transform in particularly the Cape Province where you're going to be. Cape Town is very much a British city in the way it's laid out and structured, because for the last 200 years, that's the development within the zone. But in the early years, before 1836, when slavery was made illegal, there was a large population of slaves. At one point in the 1700s, half the population of the settler communities in the Western Cape were enslaved. Okay, so half enslaved, half free, and that's not including the Khoisan peoples living on the margins, okay, because they're on the farms themselves. Okay, and the source for these people, some is Africa, some are coming from Mozambique and Angola as slaves, others are coming in from Dutch Indonesia in quite large numbers, also from Ceylon, and in fact, surprisingly, there's some Indians in there, and there's some Chinese as well, and surprise, surprise, also some European indentured laborers mixed into this mess. So it's a very large group of people who are part of the Cape Society. The last group coming in times is Indians from the Indian subcontinent. And they come across really from the 1850s. In Natal, they make up a significant portion of the population, smaller portion in Cape Town, but they're there, and they come across as indentured laborers. That means you're not a slave, but in all but name. What it is that when you're an indentured laborer, you sign a contract which gives away all of your rights for a fixed period. Your boss controls your life completely for a fixed period. At the end of the period, you're free, of course, as long as you don't owe him any money. And then you might find this thing extends. But another group of them came as what's called passenger Indians. And these were people coming across as businessmen, and they're called passenger Indians because they paid their own fare, where the indentured laborers had their fare paid by the company, whoever was importing them. So the passenger Indians came, and these are quite different. The indentured laborers predominantly Hindu, the passenger Indians predominantly Muslim. Okay, so there's this mix. Look at what's going on here. Okay, the last group is perhaps the hardest to define. The word colored in American usage, forget it. It's not the same as what you're getting in South Africa. The word colored in South Africa is something completely separate. It's hard to define because the definition is both racial and ethnic. These are the descendants of the Cape slaves and other immigrants. So it's a real genetic mix. Okay? The commonality is that they all speak Afrikaans. Okay, they're part of the, in fact, the very first recognition of Afrikaans as a language. Remember, it's very similar to Dutch, but the first time that it's recognized as a language, it's written in the language of Indonesia. It's actually written in, I think, Arabic lettering, if I remember at the stage, and it looks like it's Arabic written down, but when you sound it out, it's Afrikaans, it's not Arabic. And that's about 1750. It's very early. So this is a Creole. It's a group of people forming it. They're distinctive. They're separate from what you would think of. They're not just simply the offspring of mixed marriages. They're a very dynamic group. After 1836, and that's an important year, that's the end of slavery, they're joined by the Khoisan. Why? Because until 1836, if you came to Cape Town, what would you do for a living? It was a slave state. You couldn't say, hang out a shingle and say, I'll help build your wall for you for 10 rix dollars a day. There was no value in labor because labor was slave. So if I was a resident of Cape Town and I wanted to build a wall in 1830, I would either have my own slaves or I would arrange for a friend who had slaves. I wouldn't be looking for a laborer because all that kind of job was done by laborers. From 1836, it ceased, and large numbers of Khoisan people moved into the area from the 1830s. By the late 19th century, and this is the pattern we have today, this incipient group had changed. It had been about 50% of the genetics is Khoisan, so it's people coming from the countryside around moving in, plus all these slave descendants, plus Europeans, plus whoever else donated some of their genetic material into the group. And here's a lovely word. They metempsychos, a late colleague of mine who was based in London for a while, talked about this term. It was a psychological transformation. They changed category in their minds. And they ceased being slaves or Khoisan or else, and they merged into this identity called colored. Okay, by late 19th century, it's there. It became enforced under apartheid, and we'll see that in a moment. And eventually, now people are starting to break the mold, and they're starting to claim things like Khoisan ancestry back. But you can see this is not a simple group. It's not simply a case of the children of mixed marriages. This is a dynamic group. Its distinctiveness today, overwhelmingly Afrikaans speaking, overwhelmingly Dutch Protestant churches. Okay, this is particularly the Mission Church. Okay, so you got that in mind. Khoisan people are going to merge into colored people in Cape Town, black people who are Bantu-speaking tribal Africans, okay, and various different newcomers coming in, either as slaves or as immigrants, as the passenger Indians, or as the Europeans coming from North European Plain and other places. The balance today, well, this has been updated. I just haven't got the new figures. This was the 2001 census, and this is people speaking whose home language is whatever it is. The two top ones, it says isiZulu and isiXhosa. They together amount for about 40% of the population. Okay. And all of those are Nguni language speakers. So about 40% of the people, the Xhosa in the Cape, and you'll meet them in Cape Town, and the Zulu in KwaZulu-Natal and up onto the Johannesburg area. The Afrikaans-speaking people are going to be Afrikaner, the descendants of the white settlers, but also many of the colored people. About 13% of the population speaks Afrikaans as a home language, and you're going to find that in Cape Town. As soon as you get into the township areas outside of the city itself and sort of the southern suburbs area, you'll find people who speak Afrikaans as a home language, not English. English speakers, about 8% of the total population. And then this group here, Setswana, Sesotho, all of these groups, this is the other group, Sesotho Tswana speakers, this group all the way down here, and some others. Just for the record, there's 11 languages here, and the law of South Africa, all those 11 languages are equal in the country. Okay. In theory, let's hope you don't get dragged into court. If you get dragged into court, you can request the proceedings to be in any one of those official 11 languages. If you get invited to speak in Parliament, you can speak in any one of these 11 official languages, and they'll translate it for those who don't have the facility to speak all 11, which includes me and about 50 million other South Africans, but we won't go there. All right. All right. That kind of sets the scene. Well, South Africa is a special case because of this race classification legislation. The years of apartheid created a system in which all these groups of people I've been talking about were legislated into separate communities. And effectively, they ran what's called a four-race model. And there are the terms there in pale blue: white, colored, Indian, and African. And these were the terms which appeared under the old Group Areas Act and the Population Register. So white referring to people of European origin, colored referring to this mixed group, of this dynamic mixed group, but generally of Afrikaans language speakers, Indian referring to specifically the Indian subcontinent, and African referring to black people coming from the tribal context. It would be well and good if I was telling you that was historical. It's not, it's current. Okay? And everybody still very much thinks about this. You'll see these terms in the newspaper, and you'll see these four categories of people. This is the way in which South Africans categorize their fellows, okay, into these four categories. During apartheid, everything, including access to health care, would have been determined by your official race, and you would have a little document, and it would identify your race on the document. That's gone. Okay? But basically now class is taking over as the character, but class overlaps with race. So you're going to see it still looks very racially divided, okay? Because class and race are going to be on top of each other. All right. Well, in essence, I'm a biomedical scientist. I know the biomedical engineers are, in a sense. The journalists aren't, okay? But in a sense, you're scientists as well. You think about problems, you think about categories. Why should we bother with these? Well, biological differences are important, particularly from a medical perspective, because they have different clinical manifestations, okay? We don't need to go into any of them, but the appearance of a disease, the distribution of health assets are all going to be based on the biology of people. Okay? It's no good providing a drug regime if the group of people you're providing the drug for don't metabolize that drug properly. So there's good biological reasons, but we'll look a little deeper than that. As a concept, what's important here is that it's the visual difference between people and dividing. I mentioned before the dividing between those aspects which are cultural and and biological. Any scientific approach to research, and this includes, my friends, the journalists, any scientific approach to research requires you to compare categories. So our problem here is the definition of the categories. What exactly, when you talk about biology of race or you talk about groups of people, what is the definition you're actually using? And I've got here in pale blue at the bottom, are there simple racial categories of black and white, which is the way many of us will hear about South Africa? Are those valid? Are those the real categories that impact on the way you're seeing things? So let's spend a few moments and look at the biology of race. Okay, purely from a biological perspective. This is theory, wonderful theory. The great thing about theory is you don't have to worry about it. It's just theory. It's in the textbook. All right. The traditional classification of races, and there's a nice picture of it. Traditional classification is Caucasoid. Please note, not Caucasian. If you're a Caucasian, you come from the Caucasus Mountains. Okay, so there's a very small group of people who are real Caucasians. This is Caucasoid. It's used kind of to mean European origin, but have a look at where the red goes. It includes India. They're also Caucasoids. So you can see there's some confusion already here. There's that neat division. Down here in sub-Saharan Africa is Negroid. Out here in where my green pen is starting to lose its color power is Asian, Mongoloid. And then down here is Australoid in Australia. And then often they don't know what to do with the Aboriginal North and South Americans. We generally put them into the Mongoloid category and give them a subname called Amerindian. Okay, American Indian. But basically what we're looking at here is a 5-race categorization system. It assumes a whole bunch of things. Okay, this is the kind of thing you'll get. You'll hear it all the time. It assumes that everybody within Europe looks alike, everybody in Asia looks alike, and everybody in Africa looks alike, and et cetera, et cetera. It assumes that those races are solid, good, neat categories of people. Everybody who you classify as Negroid coming from Africa will look like everybody else that comes from Africa. So that's an assumption. linked to it is that these boundaries are real. That if you could fly there in a helicopter and get right on the boundary, over there would be black people and over there would be white people. Okay? You already know that was not going to be true. Okay? And also that this is the only possible classification of people. In fact, it isn't. This is the traditional classification. It seemed to have stuck. There's an anthropologist called Garn, I can't remember his first name, who came up with 32 neat categories. I know somebody else who comes up with about 40 categories. So the problem is a problem of definition. Are all these things, are they correct? Are these the real definitions? And where does one race start and the next one begin? And you can see immediately we have a problem here in terms of, I just want to see where the next slide is. I might have to back it up. No, it's fine. All right. Well, what's the real situation? Okay, remember, that's just a bunch of anthropologists making decisions. They decide white people look like this and live there. Black people look like this and live there. The real situation of human variation is that it varies gradually throughout the whole planet. We refer to this as clinal variation. And basically, I tell my students, can you imagine walking from Cape Town to Cairo across Africa? And, well, you can do it if you want. I don't know if your profs will let you do it, but you can start walking from Cape Town. It only takes about 2-3 years to get to Cairo on foot. But if you go, as you go up from Cape Town is very distinctive. As you get up into the countryside, you see different kinds of people in terms of skin color and hair form and shape. And as you move up into the northern province, Limpopo, on the Zimbabwe border, people again look a little bit different. As you travel Zimbabwe, as you get into Zambia, you're noticing people are getting darker and darker in skin color, hair forms and nose shapes are changing. By the time you get up into that eastern Congo area, people are very different from what you've seen in the Cape. Then you start moving into the lower valleys of Sudan and those areas, and people are changing in shape. Again, they're very dark, but now very tall and slim. And as you move up through central Sudan into northern Sudan and southern Egypt, they're starting to get paler. And by the time you hit the Mediterranean Ocean, people are paler still and don't look anything like the people that you've met down. One of the things that you would have learned by that walk, other than the fact that it cost you a lot of money and time, is that people change gradually. There isn't any point anywhere where you cross a line and you've got one racial category and the other. And in fact, there is more variability between individuals than there is between groups. Here is a statement that you may have never heard of before, but try and remember it. There is more variation in Africa between people than there is anywhere else on the planet. There's more differences between Africans than there is between Europeans and Africans. Okay, between Asians and Africans. In fact, Africa is the mother lode of human variation. Okay, and there is a huge variability. So any generalization you make starts off being wrong biologically. So we need to keep these things. This is biological fact as opposed to sociology. We're not talking about sociology, we're talking about biology. Okay. One of the problems is, what are racial differences? They are, in fact, adaptive differences to different climatic situations on the planet. Okay? They're evolution in action. Okay? Evolution does not happen at the unit of race. How many people in a race? Well, sub-Saharan Africans number about 1 billion people. Europeans number about 1.2 billion people. Asians number something in the range of about 1.5 billion people. Okay, more than that. No, we got less because we're lumping the Indians in with the Europeans. Okay, clearly, those aren't operating as biological groups. We talk about genetic change and gene pools. You don't have a gene pool of 1 billion people. You have a gene pool of maybe several thousand. Okay? The actual unit in which evolution happens is a very small unit. How do we define it? I use the word intentionally fun here because this is all about sex and reproduction. Okay? So if we're looking at that, the level at which this evolution occurs is at the local population. It's determined by who you're likely to marry. Okay? The odds are very great that the pool of people from whom you select a mate probably only numbers several thousand. Okay? You're saying, oh no, I have free choice, I can choose. You try that free choice, okay? You're going to get all sorts of uphill. It's the wrong religion, the wrong accent. Oh, even worse, the wrong social class. You know, I'm sorry, she's not good enough for our family. Try this game. It works. You know, it's a really difficult call because your mate selection is not made on physical characters. It's made on social characters. Okay? Who you choose to be a mate for life is going to be determined on social characters, not biological characters. Okay? It's going to be a group issue. Therefore, if we want to understand the biology of race, we need to understand something about human variation and how it functions. I want to introduce you to a little town in England. Liz and I went there. How long ago? It's a long time ago. It's a little village about 10 miles outside of the city of Oxford. Very nice, that lovely agricultural plain of southern England. And it's a little town of Charlton, about 10 miles out of Oxford. And its only real claim to fame is that the geneticists love it. And the reason the geneticists love the village of Charlton is they've been keeping church records of where the young men of Charlton have been getting married and who they've been getting married to for the last 400 odd years. So you can go to the church register in Charlton and you can find out what boy married what girl and where. Now, this is a very patrilocal society, which means that when you get married, the girl comes and lives with the guy's family. So if we look at the church records of Charlton, we can see where the young men are selecting brides. Okay? So let's look. Here is just 1 year. It's 1861. In 1861, I don't know how many marriages there were. It looks like about 30 or 40 marriages in the village of Charlton in 1861. And if we look, what we see very quickly, let's see if I can use the arrow here. It might be easier to show. Is it gonna? There it comes. You can see the arrow? Okay. Most of the marriages, the girls came from little villages very close to Charlton. Okay? And there's no relationship with the size of the town. Look at, there's Oxford at the bottom, and only one girl came from Oxford in 1861. These villages provided no ladies. As you got towards the end, there was generally one, maybe two ladies. Only the villages very close to Charlton provided a whole bunch of brides. Well, the reason this happens is that in 1861, the most transportation was on foot. And about 10 kilometers, that's what, about 8 miles? Or less than that, 7 miles, 7.5 miles, whatever it is. That distance, 10 kilometers, takes you about 3 hours, 3.5 hours to walk. So if you're wooing a girl, it means you got to walk 3.5 hours, if she's on the edge here, 3.5 hours to visit her, bill and coo, or whatever you did in 1861, okay, and then get home before sunset. Okay? Why? Because on average, humans do not like to travel for more than 4 hours. Very interesting thing. It's called the 4-hour rule. And it doesn't matter what it is, but about 4 hours is it. On foot, you can get about 10 kilometers in 4 hours. Okay? You can get there faster if you run, but you're not going to bill and coo when you get there. You're just going to stand and pant. Okay? So that's a reasonable length. Okay? But as transportation technology improves, it's going to increase gene flow because you can get farther on 4 hours. So let's have a look at Charlton, the full record. There's the full record. From the early 1600s until about 1860, the boys of Charlton didn't go more than about 10 kilometers. Every year was exactly the same thing. Why? Because they're walking. From 1861, it doubles. What's the gene mixer? Not horses, they're expensive. Bicycles. Okay? This is a horrible invention invented by I don't know whom, just so that genes could be mixed at a broader territory. Okay? In fact, it pushes it out almost to 40 miles. Okay? Why? Because now you can go for 4 hours on a bicycle to find your mate. Okay, and then it goes even higher as motor cars and buses and other things come in. So there's a direct link between technology and marriage patterns. So what we're looking at here is changing population dynamics. And what it means is that what's happening biologically when you select mates, and the group you identify depends on a whole bunch of things, including not just your cultural identity, but your technological level as well. So if that's the case, can we go back and define race? Well, at best, the only thing we can, when we talk about these racial categories, is they are describing human variation above the level of local population. Okay? Any race you describe, whether it be colored South Africans or black South Africans, is actually a cluster of local populations. Okay? So the biological excitement is happening way below that level of classification. Okay? So the classification is, in essence, simply a classification. That's when people say there's no such thing as race, that's what they're trying to say. They're trying to say it's a false categorization. It's real, but it's happening at a much lower level than it is at those big groups. The big groups really, if they're telling us anything, is telling us about history. So if you look at me and you look at my physical features and my hair form and my skin color and all the other physical attributes of me, it's telling you about the history of my genetic lineage. It's about history. Okay? And that history is local adaptation to where my ancestors lived however long ago, to isolation events and genetic drift, which would have impacted on small groups. It would have been rolling the dice. Some survived, some didn't. Whatever happened to my ancestors, they were the lucky ones. Okay? The ones who weren't lucky don't have any living descendants. And lastly, have cultural implications of sexual selection, because of course, people make choices based on appearance. Okay? And that it's part of that marriage selection. Okay? That I'm not going to marry a blonde girl. It's not true, I did marry a blonde girl. Anyway, you get the idea. Okay. Now, let's go back to South Africa. Who's using the categories right now? What kind of research is using the categories? All sorts of them. Social scientists, and if I would have known at the time, I would have put journalists up here. Social scientists, economics, anthropologists, historians, they're talking about groups of people, and they're talking about groups of people usually with historical social context as a commonality. Political scientists, I guess the journalists go in there too. Voting dynamics, and it's something that gets played a lot in South Africa that I'm sure if any of you are traveling, those of you who are going on the next thing will hear, the race card gets played whenever things don't work out right, play the race card. It's kind of standard political game in South Africa. You'll see it, okay, and it'll be done. Okay, but that's categorizing. It's categorizing people. Medical clinicians, drug theories, epidemiology, and then the group that I would belong to and the engineers in the group here would be the biomedical scientists, which is going to be things like access to healthcare, engineering issues, forensic research, which I do, and we'll talk about that coming up a little bit. But what we need to understand if we're going to do this is that what's happening in biology and what's happening in racial categorization may not be the same. So what we need to understand, when are we looking at biological issues? When I say race, I'm talking about biology. And when are we looking at cultural issues? And when I say culture, I'm talking about ethnicity. And let me tell you, the worst group of academics on the planet who confuse ethnicity and race are Americans. Okay? It's just interchangeable terms. They aren't interchangeable terms. One's biology and one's culture, and they're very different. What kind of category? What are the categories going on? Well, there's three broad levels of categories that we need to worry about. Genetics, which is biology, that's going to be race. So if we're talking about genetics, we're talking about race. We're talking about the biological reality of humans. If we're talking about culture, we're talking about ethnicity, which is the cultural choices and cultural appearances of humans. And here's a very interesting word. It's called a sample. Okay, anybody who does any research is going to get a sample. You're going to go to Manenberg Day Clinic and interview patients. That's a sample. Okay, and samples are statistical or population, but in fact what they are is hopefully what we want them to be is a group that makes some kind of regional sense. Okay, and we have to be aware that some people, some categories are imposed and some categories are self-chosen. And I'm going to give you an example coming up where you're going to see the difference between imposed and chosen categories. And of course, we as the researcher we're the ones who got to make the call. Okay, we're the ones who are going to try and make a decision. All right, let's have a look at that issue about self-imposed and self-diagnosed and imposed. Okay, there's four general. There's a lady in the background. I think three guys and a lady in the back giving you a really interesting smile. Okay, do you know what's going on there? What's missing? All four front incisors. Okay, this in South African terms often called the passion gap. Okay, I've been pushing for many years. I'm trying to get it to change the name. It's slowly grabbing it. One researcher can have an impact. They're slowly starting to change the name. I've been calling it the Cape Flat smile. Okay, now what it is people who have gone to a dentist and had those four teeth removed. Don't ask why yet. Okay, but come up and have it pulled. There they go. They're not unhappy. Okay. It's there. There's a Cape Town myth. When I got in Cape Town, when I arrived in the 70s, the stereotype was that only colored people did it. Black people and white people didn't do it. Only colored people did it. And they did it. It was always worded in the way of saying that somehow it was only the girls and they were pleasuring their boyfriend, and I'm not going to go any deeper into that. I'll let your imaginations run wild. Except if that's true, then right away my first observation was that it was actually mostly guys doing it. So either homosexuality was a lot more common in the Cape than I was aware of, or this theory was wrong. And I'm always game to have a go at the theory. Okay, you mustn't ever have a situation when facts ruin a good theory, right? Okay, so now we're going to look at the facts and try to. And this has been bothering me for a while. There are clinical and ethical consequences of these tooth removal. And in 2002, I got one of my students to do a major project, and what I got her to do was to go out into the northern suburbs of Cape Town, a contiguous geographic area, and interview everybody who lives in there that she could find. She eventually got 2,100 people. I'm going to show you some of the data now. And she found out who was doing this, when, and of course asked why. Well, here's some of the data from Jackie's research. Okay, her sample size there, you see 2,100 odd individuals that she met. She went to school, she went to old age homes, she went to factories, she stopped people on the street. And basically what she found in the end was that just under 40% of women had their teeth pulled in this area of Cape Town. Nearly half, just under half of the guys had it. On average, about 41% of the people, those 2,000 people she interviewed, had the smile like the guy in the picture there. This is a setup, by the way, because I needed a good photograph, and I said to one of the technicians in the department, "You know anybody who's had their teeth pulled?" He says, "Oh yeah, my good friend. I'll get a photograph of my friend." So he went with a camera to his friend, and I'm stuck with this picture with this jaunty cap for the rest of my life. But the object was to show you this nice removal of teeth. When she asked them when they did it, for girls it was around 18, for guys it was about a year earlier. So it's a teenage thing. Okay, it happens when you're a teenager. Okay, late teens. Well, she then said, okay, we're going to see the race factor here. We need to know. Now, this is a difficult call, because if you walk in and you say to somebody, "Are you black, white, Indian, or colored?" you've automatically loaded the dice. Okay, because you only give them 4 categories. So Jackie very carefully practiced this, and she said, "How do you classify yourself?" Okay, so she invited them to make the category any way they saw fit. And what she got was about 40% of people chose to categorize themselves by the apartheid categories. They identified themselves as white, colored, black. There were virtually no Indians in her sample, because remember, this was a racially segregated society, and she hadn't included an area which included Indians in her zone. Okay, because it was up in the northern suburbs, but it included white, black, and colored South Africans, and about 40% identified themselves as white, black, or colored as the way they saw their category. Another 10-15% saw religion as the thing that categorized them, and they identified themselves as Christian or Muslim. But about half and I'm very pleased about this, chose not to use those categories and called themselves South African. You think about it yourself. If somebody stopped you in the street here and said, how do you categorize yourself, what would you answer? Well, there's the South African answer. About half said South African. About 40% said racial, white, colored, or black, and about 10% identified themselves as religious categories. So, having identified these, what did the tooth data look like? Well, clearly here, you can see, certainly in the colored sample, it's very high. Okay, very, very high amongst people who self-identified as colored, very, very high. But it wasn't, the mythology said it was only colored people who did this, and very clearly that's not true. Many of the people who self-identified as Black African and many of the people who self-identified as white had also done this, although admittedly at lower levels. Whether you were Christian or Muslim didn't seem to make a difference. But there's a huge difference if they identified as South African. If they identified as South African, they were very unlikely to have had pulled their teeth. So now this is very interesting. This is an identity. What you're saying is this: if you saw yourself as a racial identity, you're more likely to have your teeth pulled. But that's okay. Is that the answer? Is it a race issue? Well, no, she continued on. She asked people about their income levels and their education level. Well, the matric is the last year of high school. So if you look at the academic level, if they had less than standard 8, it's a 10-year system. If they had less than standard 8, okay, 86% had this tooth pulled. But if they'd gone to higher than matric or gone to university, only about 13%. So there's an education factor here. Then she looked at the family income. If the family, this is 2002 data, the data were gathered in 2001. Okay, so if you were earning less than 2,000 Rand a month, don't worry about how that translates into American dollars. It would be pointless now because this is old data. 3/4 of the people at this very low socioeconomic level had pulled their teeth. When you got higher than 5,000 Rand per month, it dropped down to less than 10. You're seeing the power of socioeconomics here. This is a group, yes, there's a racial component, but it's overwhelmingly a sociocultural component, but that overlaps with race in South Africa. Okay? And what Jackie proved really wonderfully here was that this is the power of group identity. And now you're all saying, why do they pull them? Okay, the answer to that is because it's cool. It's peer pressure. Okay? It's group membership, but not group membership of a race, but group membership of a social class. Okay? This is something that marked you, and interesting of a lot of these kids afterwards had clip-in prosthetics made so they could move between social groupings. So when they're applying for a job, they clip the new teeth in. When they go out for a beer with their friends, they click it out again. Okay? So it's all about social pressure and social definition. But you could see, if I had started this by asking about race, I would have been all wrong. It's not about race. So this is what I mean by the issues of self-identification. How are people seeing groups? How are they comparing themselves to each other? So you, as researchers of one form, whatever, you're going to have to think exceptionally clearly. When you start your project, whatever the project is, you're going to have to start off by saying, what is it? What kind of sample do I need for the kinds of study I'm looking at? If I'm looking at something genetic, well, then I should use race because it's shared biological ancestry. So if I'm looking for something like presence of ABO gene, so you're looking at blood type O, it's a biological character. Your belief system doesn't impact on whether you're an O type or not. So clearly, if you're going to be using biological things, then you must need to understand that it's a biological, it's a racial issue. If you're talking about a shared sociocultural thing, like, I don't know, smoking, okay, something like that, then you're talking about ethnicity, you're talking about behaviors. Okay, and this is cultures. That's probably not that good an idea. Religion, that's a better one. If you're interviewing people about what religion and the way they adhere to a religious view, Okay, that's very much ethnicity. It's got nothing to do with race whatsoever. It's a behavioral character. If you're looking at something like pulling front teeth, then you're going to look at community. It's shared geographic or shared political or shared, in essence, a subdivision of cultural view. And each of these things is going to operate independently. Okay? And it depends on what your project is. Now, I did this before I realized I was going to have journalists with me, so let's just see if we can modify this a little bit. I want you to think of this, kind of design a project in your mind, whatever project you're going to do, okay, what categorization would be this? Race, ethnicity, or community. So for example, if you were designing a wheelchair in for townships, and we did have a group of students doing this, okay, what are the problems, what are the group you need to have wheelchair in the townships? You don't actually want to worry about race. It's not a racial issue. It's a community issue. It's where people live. But if you're particularly designing comfort of a wheelchair, it becomes a biological issue because it's about body shape. Body shape has biological components. So it's going to have some cultural components, issues about obesity, that kind of thing. So you're going to need to have some control over biology, but you're also going to have some control over culture, depending on how you do it. If you're looking at how people access an outpatient clinic, or particular something about a political view, if you're inquiring about journalistic issues, a political view, this has got nothing to do with biology. It's entirely to do with culture and ethnicity. Okay, it's belief systems. And the last one up here is prescribing a drug regime. Well, that's a biological one, if I can think of a top-class biological one. Okay, if we're talking about metabolizing a drug, we're not worried about your ethnicity. We're interested in your biology. That's when your biological heritage becomes important. So you have to think about these things. Physical parameters of people, age, sex, body size, weight, that's issues of race. Cultural preferences and choice, that's issues of ethnicity, and socioeconomic levels, of course, issues of community. What I'm trying to do with you guys is to get you to think about the nature of the research rather than the essence of the category. The category is secondary to the research. Okay? These are questions, I asked these of anatomists. Okay, so we're talking about classically, somebody's doing research on the cadavers in the department of the medical school UCT. What have all the sample got in common? They're all dead. Okay, lying on a marble tray, or marble trolley. Okay, and they've all donated their body to medicine. Okay, so if that's the case, who does your sample represent? Okay, where do they come from? Would it be best to think of your sample in geographic or community terms? Certainly, these are almost at the end. In community terms rather than racial or ethnic ones. Who donates their body to medical school? Is that based on race or is it a cultural thing? Okay? The answer is going to be overwhelmingly cultural. I haven't seen a lot of Muslims donating their body to medicine. Why? Very, very strongly against that in cultural beliefs. Have you confused race with ethnicity? And I ask all my American colleagues, have you done that? And they look at me and say, well, aren't they the same thing? No. Okay. Have you confused language with ethnicity? This is interesting because language is a very, very strong group identifier. Okay. So are we looking at languages or are we looking at cultural behaviors and how do they interact? By the way, these are all unanswerable. You have to answer them. Okay? And has history had an impact on your study? And this is where you got to worry about names and things. Okay? People are sensitive to how they're identified. That's why it's always best to ask people to self-identify. If they self-identify, then they've called themselves the name, not you. So it becomes an important issue. Are you imposing the categories, or are you getting the people to tell you the categories? Again, I can't answer that question. It's going to depend on your research and your nature. All right, I want to end with one last thing, a little bit of symbolism that you're going to meet. And South Africa is busy trying to build a single nation. Okay? One of the nice things about the United States is that the United States has a very powerful national entity. Okay? Americans are Americans, and they think the rest of the world Well, they're not aware of most of the rest of the world. Okay, but it's wonderful. There's a real national identity here. Well, South Africans clearly are going to have a problem. We don't have a national identity. We're trying to build one. We've gone through 40 years of government telling us there is no national identity. There's black, white, colored, and Indians, and now we're trying to move that together. The old national motto was in Latin, ex unitate viris, which literally translates as from unity, strength, in Latin, which you might note is an extinct language. Why do you choose an extinct language? Because it never changes. Okay? That meaning is never going to alter because I don't know anyone who speaks Latin as a first language. Yeah? So the South Africans did the same thing. Let's find a motto in a language that no one's using. Well, here's a motto in Am, which is an extinct San language. And the motto, if I can get the pronunciation right, is P-E-Ara-Ki. Okay, 3 different clicks. Okay, it's an extinct language. Don't expect anybody to stop you in the street and speak to you in this language. It's gone. Okay, and its meaning is people of different origins are joining together, or the academics fight with each other. Possibly people who differ in opinion are talking to one another. Well, it's really not an issue because whoever coined the language is no longer speaking it. So either one will do, and you will find this on the coat of arms of the country, on every official government letter, on every currency bill you see. It'll be on there, and there it is. There's the South African coat of arms, and there is the motto, Ki-E-Ara-Ki. Okay? And it's from 2000, it's the official motto. It means unity and diversity, or diverse people unite officially. Okay, so they've kind of morphed the original meaning into that. So it's unity and diversity, and you will see it on everything that you get out there. All your visas, the whole works. You're going to find it out there. Learn to pronounce that motto. No one will ever ask you to do it. Okay, but it'd be great if you can do it. And what you guys need to be is the judge. Okay, is it working? Okay, it's only been 10, 12 years. Okay. You are something you're going to have to look at. Are South Africans building a national unity, or is this whole thing completely undermined by the 40 years of race classification beforehand? Okay? And again, this is another one of these things that I can't answer for you. For those of you traveling there, this is what you keep in mind. You keep in mind that here is a group of people trying to create a national identity, trying very hard to do it, yet coming from a system which continues today where people perceive differences. Okay? Now, I threatened at the end to introduce this book. It has absolutely nothing to do with journalism and nothing to do with biomedical engineering. It's something I produced last year, but in fact, it covers exactly the same issues. I talk about here about how to deal with racial issues and racial identity and how people perceive themselves as different categories. Okay? And for me, it's a major issue because I look at a skull and make an identification, and I'm telling it to a policeman who has a completely different vision of the world than I do. Okay, and it's that policeman that's got to go out there and perhaps try and find that individual, whatever. It's a very much a forensic issue, but the problems are the same, particularly the problems of race. And I brought some extra copies along here. You can have a look at them. So I'd love to hand them out, but I can't. If you're really keen, I have to get $25 from you. That's what the publisher nailed me for them. So, but if you'd like them, I'm happy to sign them for free. All right, if you feel like that, I'll charge for the signing too. No, not that. Anyway, but just hands up, please tell me how many are going to South Africa of the group? Virtually everyone. Okay, just with a few hangers-on who are kind of came in to give moral support to those going to the Lions. All right. Well, think about what we covered tonight. Think about what we talked when you start getting your projects and start seeing people. Watch for the Cape Flat smile. You'll see it within 20 minutes of getting off the airplane. Okay? But think about where you see it and who you're seeing it with. Okay? Bring it to their attention if you like. I don't know what response you're going to have. Probably just a chuckled response, and it's part of South African life. But what I've introduced to you is this. I've tried to sensitize you to categories. There's an email address there. Please jot it down. I will be based in beautiful downtown Columbus, Ohio, while you're in South Africa, but by all means, if you've got a question or an issue that I can help with, send me an email. Just remind me that you were here. Thanks very much.